Well, good afternoon. Welcome to Sealaska Heritage Institute and our clan house, Hashuka. I'm very pleased to announce that this is unfortunately the last in the series of our lectures this November for Native American Heritage Month, but we have a great one in store today. My name is Chuck Smythe, and I'm the director of the Culture and History Department here. And I would like to remind everybody about Celebration coming up, June 10th through the 13th. Please feel free to come down and bring your family and tell them to come to Juneau during that week and enjoy that. We do have a sign-in sheet, and we would appreciate if you would sign in and also provide your email so that we can do some follow-up with our evaluator to hear your suggestions about how to improve this or future topics would be helpful to us as we continue to develop and plan the lecture series. Also, we have, I forget what I was going to say next, cell phones. Remember, please turn your cell phones off. And so I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Thomas Thornton, who's going to speak on herring egg distribution in Alaska, generosity, reciprocity, and benefit flows. Dr. Thornton came to Alaska in the early 90s after finishing his dissertation on Tlingit land and ideologies for the University of Washington. And he worked for the Subsistence division for a couple of years, and then moved over to UAS, where he was in the Faculty of Anthropology there and chaired the social science faculty for a couple of years through 2000. From 2001 to 2003, he was associate professor at the Department of Global Studies, St. Lawrence University in New York. Then he was visiting associate professor of anthropology at Trinity College in Hartford from 2003 to 2006. And from 2006 to 2008, he was professor of anthropology and American Indian Studies at Portland State University, where he is currently an affiliate research professor. Then he went distant. He went to the United Kingdom from 2008 to 2018, where he was Director of Environmental Change and Management Program and Associate Professor of Anthropology at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford, where he continues as affiliate professor. And then in 2018, he came back to Juneau to all of our benefit, and he is currently the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences and Vice Provost for Research and Sponsored Programs at UAS. He has been involved in numerous environmental anthropology and human ecology research projects with national and international partners in Europe, Asia, and North America. His research and publications focus especially on the social ecological relations between peoples, lands, and waters of Southeast Alaska and the North Pacific. Most notably, he is the author of Being in Place Among the Tlingit, editor of Our Grandparents' Names on the Land, which became the foundation of our place names exhibit. All 3,500 place names in here are in the exhibit now in that place names table. We're very, this is a major reference source if you ever are interested in the Tlingit spelling of place names throughout Southeast. This is the one to go to. He also edited Ha'ani, Our Land, which was a very useful report in the days of subsistence when there was very little information about traditional land use and occupancy in Southeast Alaska. It's the original Goldschmidt and Haas report, but this one has all the interviews that they did, so it's very useful for looking through and seeing in the 40s the people who were alive then and what they said about the lands and the places they went to and how they used them. And then last but not least, we have publishing in a week or two. We'll be publishing this and having a celebration here on December 6th, first Friday of Tom's most recent report for us the distribution of subsistence herring eggs from Sitka Sound, Alaska. This is a pre-publication copy. We'll have final copies for sale here in our store. So please, after hearing the lecture, I'm sure you'll be interested in that. And finally, he is currently finishing a book with Madonna Moss entitled Herring and People in the North Pacific. So very pleased to have you, Thomas.
Thank you, Chuck. It's about right for me. I just have to stand up straight. So thank you, Chuck, for that introduction. And I guess when I listen to it, I really sound like a nomad wandering about. I've been more places than herring eggs from Southeast Alaska, but maybe not quite. And I want to thank Sealaska Heritage Institute for sponsoring this series. We ended up running a one-credit course for this, which meant that I came to just about every one of them. And I've certainly learned a lot. And if there's been a theme, it's certainly been the kind of legal historical context and framework for Alaska Native rights and development in the 20th century. And certainly this talk is designed to be a piece of it, but I'm not a lawyer. So we've had quite a few people who are lawyers, and I'm not a Native leader. I'm really coming at it from an anthropological perspective. And most of the research for this talk was conducted in 2018, actually before I came back to Southeast Alaska to become Dean of Arts and Sciences at UAS, and then was kind of written and finished on weekends primarily. But now that I am Dean at UAS, I'm very appreciative of having the invitation to speak today because it allowed me to miss a budget meeting at the university, and those are not happy occasions of late if you've been following the university. So I also want to thank up front, in addition to Sealaska Heritage Institute, Bethany Goodrich, who was actually not quite a student of mine in Oxford, but she was in the same department in another program and now lives in Sitka, and she takes a number of beautiful photographs, a number of which have been published elsewhere, but these most of these, unless otherwise noted, are hers, that she's taken over the past several years, including that young man, Elijah Lawrence, holding up some herring eggs on hemlock boughs. Okay, so to get the legal context, a couple of things are relevant. One is the Constitution, and if you've sat through this series, you've maybe come across this part of this Alaska State Constitution, Article 8, but I want to look at it in the context of what I'm going to call maximum sustained yield and maximum sustained benefits. I think of the Alaska Constitution as actually quite a progressive document. It's one of the few state constitutions that actually talks about sustainability. And there are reasons for that, historical reasons having to do with unsustainability in fisheries, and we should be grateful for that. But it talks about it in a couple of ways, and so the emphasis is mine here, but we hear about maximum use consistent with the public interest. We hear about utilization, development, and conservation of all natural resources belonging to the state, including those in the land and waters, for the maximum benefit of its people, so the state's people. And then, of course, there's the Common Use Clause, and finally the Sustained Yield Clause, which is really supports the concept of sustainable yield in fisheries and fisheries management. So all of these are important, but they actually are kind of at contradiction in the case of the subsistence herring egg fishery. Then you have federal and state subsistence law, and particularly Title VIII. And so just looking at this, you've got not really a definition of subsistence, but of subsistence uses. You've got this notion of priority consumptive use belonging to subsistence over commercial and recreational uses of fish and wildlife and other renewable natural resources, especially if there's an allocation situation. And you have this declaration that subsistence is essential to the native physical, economic, traditional, and cultural existence. There's also a statement about it being essential to non-native physical, economic, traditional, and social existence. And so a lot of things turn on the difference between social and cultural. But I'm not sure what was meant ultimately by those two different terms. But I think as has been discussed in previous lectures, this represents a bit of a compromise, right? Because we didn't get full restoration of Alaska native hunting and fishing rights through ANCSA or through ANILCA. Those things were extinguished through ANCSA, but there was an attempt to try to protect Alaska native subsistence. And that ended up being really a protection for rural residents' subsistence practices, at least in state law. But the subsistence priority was conserved. And there are criteria for assigning that priority. It doesn't apply to all resources in all places. And these are the so-called 8 criteria. I'm not going to go through them, but I just want to point out that one critical one, which we can call criterion 7, is concerns distribution and exchange, which is the topic of this talk. And it's defined here as a pattern of taking, use, reliance, where the harvest effort or products of that harvest are distributed or shared, including customary trade, barter, and gift giving. So, and these terms too have a kind of legal definition. So there are different types of subsistence and non-subsistence exchanges that are regulated in Alaska. So the top here shows 3 different forms of subsistence exchanges, right? You've got sharing, different kinds of sharing. There's something called generalized reciprocity, which is an anthropological term, which I'll come back to. Delayed reciprocity, redistribution, and ceremonial gifting. Then you've got barter, which is exchange of one item for another, and not including money, at least in the state definition. And then customary trade, which can include customary trade for cash, okay? And this is a recognition in the state subsistence law that cash has been around for generations, and it has become customary and traditional in some cases to trade subsistence foods for cash. And again, this doesn't apply to all subsistence food, but it does apply to herring eggs, okay? But of course, these uses are separated from commercial uses, including things like commercial sales of such products, okay? Okay, and one of the classic issues then, if you have a priority for subsistence, is how do you execute that? And this is a big problem for the commercial versus the subsistence herring fishery. There's a temporal problem, a timing problem, because when you are fishing for sacro, you have to, which is what occurs in Sitka Sound and is the major fishery there that takes 99% of the herring and the herring eggs, but it gets them while they're still in the sac of the female herring. And so when you do that, you are a priori taking the herring before it can actually lay its eggs for the subsistence harvest to occur. So that makes prioritizing subsistence a bit of a challenge, right? You have to get it right. You have to guess or model or predict how much herring is going to come back. You have to apply this maximum sustainable yield principle to take that much that you can harvest, and then there still has to be enough left over for subsistence, because subsistence can't necessarily, depending on how it's managed, depending on how much herring there is, can't necessarily take their harvest first, because they have to wait for the herring to lay their eggs. They don't take them in the sack. So that's a fundamental issue in this fishery. But you might want to know some other things about the fishery. One is that once the commercial fishery, once the sacro is brought to the processors at the dock, it's basically becomes the purview of Japanese processors who remove the sacro and grade it, and then it is shipped to Japan, frozen, where it becomes a product known as kaznoko, which had a very lucrative market for it, particularly in the 1990s when Japan was at the height of its economic power, although the price and the demand has been declining in recent years. It used to be that the byproducts of that, once you got the skein, were chopped up and discarded and put into the bay. So the ultimate beneficiaries were maybe seagulls and crab. But now the rest of the herring has value and is shipped, but not to Japan. Ultimately, it goes to other Asian countries and is used to produce things like farmed salmon feed, which of course competes directly with farmed salmon, competes directly with wild salmon. But other things also like pet food and fertilizers and what we might consider low-end products. So that's the basic picture of the fishery. And then you have this problem that while this fishery has grown up since the 1970s, you had a corresponding decrease in spawning density, extensity, duration, quality, and reliability and of the subsistence egg harvest. And that has really thrown a wrench in their own model, which I call a model of cultivated abundance, where you're actually laying this substrate, these hemlock boughs that Wade Martin has here in his boat at the bottom of the picture, and creating habitat or substrate for herring to spawn upon, and then removing, typically not all of it, but a portion of it for your own use. It's actually a very conservative fishery. It's also a renewable fishery because the herrings, when they spawn, they don't die like salmon. They can live to spawn again, sometimes for up to 15 years. But because it comes after the commercial fishery, the conflicts have emerged. Okay? But we have to go back further to understand what's happened. Herring as an industry rose beginning in 1882 with the development of what's called reduction plants. Okay, essentially herring oil began to replace whale oil as a primary product in industrial manufacturing and in agriculture. And large quantities of herring were taken by large seiners, 100-foot seiners that really worked all the way from South America with anchovies up to sardines off the California coast and then into Southeast Alaska. They had a kind of seasonal cycle. And the first one was built in 1882, but already, and you didn't really get another one built until the World War I era, but already by the 1920s, and it was actually Walter Soboleff, about whom another lecture was devoted in this series, that you were already seeing depletion of localized stocks of herring. We interviewed Walter Soboleff for an earlier project I worked on called Herring Synthesis, and he told us he worked in the Killisnoo herring reduction plant in the 1920s, and we asked him, he said, where were they fishing in the 1920s? Were they fishing still right around Angoon and Killisnoo, or had they been moved elsewhere? Because there was known to be quite a concentration of herring in that area. And he said, no, by the time I was working there, they were already fishing way down south at the bottom of Admiralty Island. And so local supplies had already been depleted. Nevertheless, the peak of the harvest during the reduction era comes in 1929, and then it crashes, and you get the first real regulation of herring fisheries in the 1940s. And it's never really recovered. And so this is all before statehood and territorial days. And so when the Alaska Department of Fish and Game comes on the scene, you already have a situation of what we might call a shifted baseline, using Daniel Pauly's language, which means what you see as normal has actually shifted from a superabundance of herring in places like Killisnoo and many, many others. You've got now herring concentrated in fewer places, and that becomes essentially the new normal. And that's what you start measuring with your fisheries science. And so a big part of that synthesis project was to go back into people's memories who had been around before statehood and get their observations of where herring had spawned, where they had massed, and what had changed over that period of time. But as things became more concentrated, what's interesting is things have also become spatially concentrated, so that most of the herring now, most of the biomass, as they call it, is now spawning at Sitka Sound. So it's become kind of the mecca for subsistence as well as commercial fishing. And that happened really beginning in the 1990s, and that has led to conflicts over this question of who has priority and how can we ensure that subsistence needs in particular are taken care of under the law. And this, of course, has come to a head with the recent Sitka lawsuit. They filed suit last December against the state, the Department of Fish and Game, seeking an injunction to prevent the 2019 fishery, Sakharov fishery. That was not successful, but the case is proceeding and will begin, I think, in January of next year. And similar actions are occurring on the Canadian side, where you have had successful injunctions filed against basically the same type of fishery there, a Sakharov fishery. But there they have a stronger framework of Aboriginal rights that protect their Aboriginal fishing rights. They haven't ceded them yet. They're actually being negotiated and settled in treaties as we speak. But doing anything to damage what would become a future treaty right is something that's actionable legally. So you might argue that they've had more success because they have a stronger Aboriginal rights system. Okay, I used a couple terms here which I'll mention now. When we talk about herring, we can think of it as a foundation species from a biological point of view. It's a foundation of the marine ecosystem in that it does an incredible job of converting energy from the little critters that it eats, like krill and phytoplankton or zooplankton and so on, and turns them into energy for higher trophic levels, not just things like salmon and cod, and black cod, which we like, but also bigger things like halibut, harbor seal, whales, and even seabirds. So it's tremendously important for its ecosystem services to the marine food web. It's also a bellwether species or an indicator species in the sense that when herring begins to decline, you right away see those knock-on effects on other trophic levels of the food chain. And then finally, it's called a cultural keystone species because of its critical role in as a food source, but also as a heritage food and for its exchange values, among other things. So all of those things play into the conflict. And the traditional knowledge is quite strong around this, and it's really what brought me to the topic. As far back as the mid-1990s, I was hearing statements like this one from Herman Kitka in Sitka. He said, before the commercial herring Sakharov fishery, the Sitka Tlingit engaged in herring fishing from small rowboats and prior to that canoes. The herring caught, either raked or netted, were used to make herring oil. Herring eggs were taken and dried in the trees among the islands around Sitka. All the small islands have names and were used together with all the other families in the Sitka area. Herring fishing was the last week of March and the first 2 weeks of April, mostly under our uncle's direction for each family group. And there you see some of the drying of herring eggs in the trees. I've been told by people in Sitka that some of the trees were even trained, kind of like Japanese bonsai, to be good dryers. You know, they spread out the branches so you could set out the eggs on them and dry them. You also see people drying them in frame houses during the historic era, and I heard stories in Sitka about people drying them also inside over their wood stoves. So lots of different ways to do that. And then historically they were packed or shaped into cakes, sometimes packed in boxes or other containers, and then taken for trade all the way into the interior, down and up the coast. And they were considered a very high value trade item, and of course that's still the case today. Okay, so when I talk about shifted baselines, we can also see this in the historic era. So this is a map that shows herring management areas, broadly speaking. And you might be overwhelmed when you look at it by the closures. Okay, so in the fish and game era, where you're already talking about a shifted baseline, at one time, all of these, or maybe not all at once, were open as commercial herring fisheries. Now they're all closed, which doesn't mean there's no herring there, but it means there's not enough herring to support a commercial fishery. So again, this points to the concentration of fishing, both for subsistence purposes as well as for commercial purposes, now really in two places. Klawock, or Craig, for spawn on kelp, which is abbreviated SOK there, and Sitka Sound for sacro. And the spawn on kelp is, of course, also produced for subsistence at Craig, and a little bit in Sitka Sound, but at Sitka Sound it's primarily eggs on branches. And here we get a kind of perspective that sometimes is the divide between the commercial fishermen and the longer tradition of subsistence knowledge of the fishery. This quote from a commercial fisherman here at the bottom says, "The amount of spawn in the area is much stronger than 40 years ago." And that's actually true, according to biomass models, but you're not going back far enough. You're looking at a baseline that was severely depleted and has come up a little bit, but it's nowhere near the historical levels. You take a perspective from another fisherman, a commercial fisherman. This is actually Martin Perez from Ketchikan, who we interviewed in 2007, I think, who is already 92 years old. He said the herring population now is just a drop in the bucket. Compared to what it used to be. We went through schools and schools of herring in my young days, all the way down from Alaska to Washington and Oregon, schools and schools of herring. Now we don't see that anymore. And, 100 people told us this in their own words in different ways, but especially those who were alive before the 1940s could talk about that. Okay, and then to see how things have changed and get another perspective on the fishery. So we're honing in now on Sitka Sound, which is the mecca, I'm going to call it that, for herring egg and roe production now. And the orange outline area there represents the historical stronghold, if you will, or extensity. I wouldn't even say extensity, but the main areas where people were harvesting herring eggs traditionally. But it's also an attempt to render how herring moved into Sitka Sound. So the blue arrows talk about them coming really from both directions into Sitka Sound and then spreading out, and those dotted sort of ovoids actually represent trenches where herring will sort of sink down as they become gravid and then rise to move into spawn. And typically the spawning began around Herring Rock, which is now a sacred site to the Kiksati clan, and they have a whole narrative about how they were taught, essentially, or shown how to gather herring eggs on substrate from a woman who laid on this rock, and her hair went in the water, and the fish began to spawn on it. And that's commemorated in the blankets you see there, the Chilkat blanket worn by Al Perkins, which represents the rock essentially as an animate object, and the herring are around it. So that's kind of in the middle. You can see it's kind of in the middle of the map there. And basically, the herring spread out from there, and they start to look for places to spawn in the coastline around Sitka and in the islands, as Herman Kitka mentioned. But it went all the way up to past Neva Point and down to Dorothy Narrows. So a lot of coastline was covered with spawn. But now things are very much concentrated right, almost right in front of town and over on Kruzof, the eastern side of Kruzof Island. And it's much less reliable, the extent is much smaller, and the duration has shrunk from 3 or 4 weeks of spawning down to just a few days, if that. So this is really where the concern comes from. Okay, a little bit about how the herring egg system is organized. So traditionally, at least from the historic records and the oral history, you organize the production and distribution of herring eggs through the matrilineal house groups and their local and non-local relatives. The eggs were harvested, as I mentioned, on branches primarily, but also branches which were placed in the water, but also on naturally occurring macrocystis or broad kelp and hair kelp, both of which were also taken. And we have accounts from the mid-19th century, Russian accounts, that talk about 2,000 people coming into Sitka to harvest, about half of them from other communities. So the population of Sitka historically was one of the highest among island Tlingit communities, but it was never that much more than 1,000. And of course, this is during the Russian occupation, so there are good records, but they're saying that there's another 1,000 coming into town. And interestingly, it may not be that the population doubles nowadays, but there are ways that people find to go to Sitka. People told me that, from places like Metlakatla and elsewhere, if they can arrange their medical appointment to be around herring time in Sitka, they might do that if it's an elective thing, partly so they can be there during that time because, it's traditional to go into Sitka. So some of these people would join what we might call the production unit. They will actually participate in the harvest and processing of herring, or they will support it in other ways, or they will trade or whatever. Now, the traditional harvest was not quantified except the time frame, and again, you get that 3 to 4 week time frame is documented, just as Herman Kitka was talking about in the earlier slide. So it seems like that was a fairly stable duration from at least the mid-19th century up until the early to mid-20th century. But we don't have a quantification of harvest, but I would estimate, based on the household production from that number of people, that it was probably at least 400 or 500,000 pounds. Now today, even though the Sitka native population is now about 4,000, so much higher than it was there at the time of the mid-19th century, what they define, the Alaska Board of Fisheries defines as the ANS, or the amount necessary for subsistence, is only about 136 to 227,000 pounds, okay? So where do they get that figure? That's based on harvests since 2001. It's not based on a population or a needs estimate. It is simply based on harvests that have occurred since 2001, after this shifted baseline, after this conflict has emerged with the commercial fishing and the complaints essentially to the state that there's not enough opportunity for subsistence. People are not able to harvest what they require for their subsistence needs. So I think the methodology of computing the amount necessary for subsistence is quite dubious and probably wouldn't stand up to legal scrutiny. But that's my perspective. And then, of course, the other thing that's happened is production has become more specialized and concentrated. My old colleague at Fish and Game, or Stephen, mine's old colleague Bob Wolf, used to talk about the super household. That is to say, households with equipment and means and labor produce 70 or 80% of the harvest. 20% produces 80% of the harvest, or 30%. It used to be 30-70, now it's closer to 20-80. And that rule applies here. It may even be more specialized. Okay, so the patterns, we talked about generalized reciprocity. We talk about simply sharing and gifting, maybe with an expectation that you might get something back at some point, but not necessarily a balanced exchange or even a precise expectation. Balanced reciprocity is more like barter and trade. You expect something of comparable value back. And then there's even negative reciprocity. I don't necessarily want to talk about this, but there's theft that people report of their sets of branches that they put out for herring. That's become an issue. But it's usually more like a manipulation. That's what negative reciprocity means. And maybe the best way to sum it up is a joke that people sometimes tell around herring time, which is, when it's herring time, everybody's your uncle or your auntie, meaning they're kind of using the kinship system to try to make a connection to you so that they can receive herring eggs. But like I said, it's a bit of a joke. So all of those kinds of reciprocity exist. We also find that new technologies are entering into the harvest. It's not just things like motorized boats, but preservation has changed. So most preservation is now by freezing, and a lot of the distribution out of town is done by air freight. You still have boats transporting it as well, but a lot of it is done by air freight. And these things require money. And so this is one of the key roles of cash. And as I said, it supports the production as well as the distribution. So it's not just that people might pay the shipping cost to get a 50-pound wetlock box of herring eggs over to Juneau, which might cost $100 or whatever. But it's also that your uncle, who maybe has moved to Juneau, is in the pioneer home or whatever, may actually make a contribution to your production unit by saying, hey, I'll pay you for your gas, and he won't say, if you give me some eggs. He's sort of just investing in your production unit so you can go out and harvest. But of course, he's very likely to get some in return. So the role of cash is very complicated. It's legal, but it's also controversial. So many people will not take cash for herring eggs. Others will, especially if people don't have anything of comparable value to offer. So often in urban areas where people wouldn't have their own native foods, they might offer cash as customary trade. So that's a very interesting situation, because I think it's sort of not settled, people's relationship with cash. Other things to say is that you just have a wide geographic extensity of herring egg distribution, and you have an incredible intensity of distribution. 87% of herring eggs on average are distributed. And so that's an enormous percent. It might be the highest of any resource in the state. But it has to be distributed also in a very short period of time if you want them to get places fresh, because they will turn, obviously. And most of them are distributed fresh, and some will be frozen either upon receipt or sometimes kept for ceremonies and things that are coming up, but many of them are shipped fresh. So it's a big spike in the air cargo that occurs in early April. Then you have ceremonies, both what traditionally were called potlatches or kuiks, where herring eggs are served, and they're particularly important to the Kiksadi group because of their association with herring and as a crest, and herring rock as an atu or sacred piece of geography. But they also are important at the household level, household feasts. There's a nice quote here from Tom Gamble, who's a younger, not an elder, but an active harvester. And he says something that was actually repeated in a lot of ways by a lot of people. And he says, I don't remember a time when I was eating herring eggs on my own. Have you ever tried to eat herring eggs on your own? It's kind of weird. Okay, so how do people describe this? It's typically, they're shared often when you first collect them. So if you pick up, your first herring bow out of the water, and there's another boat next to you, you might share some of your herring eggs with them, and they might share some with you, or you might share some with your crew and actually eat them raw. People do that. But then once you get home and you bring your harvest home, I had lots of people describing the ritual of clearing the table, laying out the newspaper, and then bringing out the seal oil or hooligan oil, soy sauce, whatever it is, and then putting the branches out, and everybody comes over. So it's what Durkheim called elementary communion, if you're into anthropology, or what Victor Turner called communitas, where everybody partakes of this in a kind of almost like a feast out of time, where everybody can be equal in their consumption of this first food of the year. Then, as I said, they're also kept for communal events. One of the ones that I found interesting was that there's a big distribution system in Hoona, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But they keep their eggs for an end-of-the-year party. It's like a school kuik, if you will, that feeds 300 people. And they get Sitka eggs distributed from Sitka. They hold on to and they stretch them so they feed everybody by using another neat trick. which is herring egg salad. If you make a salad with herring eggs, you don't need quite as many, and a few eggs can be stretched quite a long way. And then finally, one of the attributes of this system is it's really resilient and adaptive. So I looked at it intensively in probably one of the poorest years for herring subsistence egg harvest. It was not a good year in 2018, and yet the distribution remained wide, and almost everyone who wanted some was able to get some through the distribution network. So it's remarkably resilient and adaptive and even redundant. Typically, the elders that I talked to had more than one connection to get herring eggs. So it might be one through a relative, another through an organization, or whatever. Okay, some more statistics. 80 to 90% of households give herring eggs. I said 87% on average are given away of the total harvest. Virtually 100% of those wanting herring eggs, hungry for it, as they sometimes say, are able to receive it, even in, and especially in neighboring communities. Roughly 40% are distributed within Sitka, from Sitka Sound, and 60% outside of Sitka. And I think that pattern may be very representative of how it was traditionally, too, going back at least to that Russian period. And as I said, there's both immediate and future sharing that goes on, and there's both primary and secondary distribution. So a lot of people, for example, will ship herring eggs in a bulk shipment because it's cheaper, and they'll send them to Juneau, they'll send them to Anchorage, but expecting that their relative or contact there will further subdivide them and distribute them. And that secondary distribution, nobody's ever tried to quantify that, but I say if you add it all up, it's easily 5,000 to 10,000 people who are receiving herring eggs, even in 2018, which was not a good year. And of course, this is documented not necessarily anthropologically, but by inspectors and other types. So here's an account from 1914 that's actually pretty good, because the guy counts the boxes that he sees basically on the boat coming from Sitka Sound back to Juneau, and he even reports the prices. A 50-pound box would get $2, which covered shipping in 1914. It's a little more expensive than that now, but maybe $120 to $150. Okay. The other thing that's happening on the subsistence side is you have the kind of revitalization of a herring festival. So when 2,000 people were in town, 1,000 coming from out of town in the 19th century, that was really a celebration of the return of life, the return of herring and all the things that eat herring, whether it's halibut, salmon, seals, seabirds, whales. It was a kind of festive time, and partly out of frustration for the Board of Fisheries hearing mode, where you're limited to 2 minutes, I think, to speak. When the red light goes on, you have to stop, and to kind of take back the discourse and reconnect it with the rest of the cultural practices. A group of, it was originally Kiksadi, but joined by other native and non-native groups, developed an organization called the Herring Rock Water Protectors, and it's modeled after the Standing Rock organization that was opposing the pipelines that were going through their sacred lands. And their emblem there is that, again, that image of Herring Rock with the female herring circulating around it, getting ready to spawn. So they invited everyone. I think 2018 was the first one. They invited everyone to this kuik, this invite, and they gave them some herring eggs, and they tried to communicate with them, not in 2 minutes with the red light, but on their own time and in their own cultural space, what herring eggs and herring egg distribution means to Sitka people. And they even invited the Board of Fisheries, and I think 4 of them came, and they were invited to speak. They weren't limited to 2 minutes. And so I think it was a successful sort of way of shifting the discourse away from simply numbers like amount necessary for subsistence and management areas, and really saying this is what herring mean to us. The connections are not just physical, it's not just about food security, it's about this idea that it's a cultural keystone, it's vital to our identity, to our heritage, to our future. And so they had another one in 2019, and I was able to attend that one. And what I wanted to show you is they actually, that's in the top corner there, they actually shaped the herring bows to look like Mount Edgecombe, which was pretty cool. But it's not a good photo now because they gave half of them away. So you're only seeing one slope of Mount Edgecombe kind of in herring eggs with the real image in the back. Can you see that? It was better when they first laid them out. But that was a remarkable effort to collect all of that and then to give it away. And I think there were several hundred people there. I don't know the exact attendance. And then one of the things they've adopted is, interestingly, a quote from Gus Speth, who is the head of the Yale School of Forestry and Conservation. And the quote is, "The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation, and we scientists don't know how to do that." And so that's the kind of their rallying cry for introducing this special kuik and reigniting the herring festival. Okay, so kind of beginning to sum up, thinking about factors affecting recent herring distribution. You've got these socio-cultural factors, which include things like traditional knowledge, skills, but also maybe modern issues like time in a community where people have jobs and other commitments, and also means, the money to purchase the equipment, to pay for the gas, to shoulder the shipping costs, and so on. You've got that combined with issues in the ecological sphere, including the sufficiency of spawning, the quality, the duration, the reliability, and accessibility of spawn. And what's happening basically is areas that were once proximal, reliable, and very productive are now not producing with the same predictability and quality as in the past. And a knock-on effect of this is you have increasing competition, okay? And one of the things that's thrown a wrench into the distribution system is that the commercial industry has an interest group called the Sitka Herring Conservation Alliance, and they sort of came in with the philosophy that, hey, we've got boats and we've got some money, we can invest and essentially get your herring eggs for you. And so they developed a program to do that, paying harvesters to bring herring eggs to the dock so that the product would be there, and then distributing these eggs free of charge, basically on a first-come, first-served, no-limit protocol for distribution. But the problem with that is that with fewer and fewer reliable areas, the people that they were paying to get these herring eggs, which is something that may be not necessarily legal either, were competing with the traditional harvesters who weren't being paid but were doing it on their own in the few areas that were close to town that were reliable. And because they were being paid by the pound, they were throwing lots and lots of branches there and then getting what they could and then bringing it back to the dock. So a lot of people complained that they weren't of very much quality, but the bigger issue was that they were taking as much as 40% of the total subsistence eggs harvest and then distributing it according to a different distribution protocol. And what I argue in the study, which Chuck alluded to, is that this effectively crowds out subsistence values as well as other people's branches, literally, from the bays where spawning is occurring. And so this became such an issue that the Sitka tribe of Alaska sent a letter to the Conservation Alliance asking them to stop this practice, and I believe it was discontinued in 2019. I don't know if there's a chance or a plan to continue it or not. This graph is just to show you the extensity of distribution. So 41 communities I counted going back over the records, and the records are really just fish and game data that's supplied by the Division of Subsistence, and it's a supplemental survey that I helped design. And so not everybody takes it. It's not a full sample, but even if, with a partial sample over that many years, you see that 41 communities are distributed to, and many of them year after year. And so what I tried to do in this table, which I'd be surprised if you could read, is to document where all these communities are. Most of them, as I said, are in the state, but they go down to Washington, Oregon, some into the interior, places like BC and the Yukon. And I tried to gauge what the level of distribution was according to some rules and some quick rules of thumb. But basically, if you look at the last column, you see certain communities have what I describe as high, medium, or low distribution. And so you might predict that communities in the region would be on the higher end of distribution. That's true. But when you get outside of the region, it seems to be regional centers and urban centers that command the most. So places like Uktiavik or Barrow, for example, and of course Anchorage. And then in southeast, it would be places like Juneau and Ketchikan. But surprisingly, there are places that have pretty high distribution benefit from Sitka Sound herring eggs that you might not expect. Metlakatla, for example, has strong historic ties to the Sitka Sound herring egg fishery, and that's manifest today in distribution, even though they have their own herring fishery in Metlakatla. So that was quite an interesting finding. And then we asked a bunch of other questions in a supplemental survey, which I won't have time to go over. But one of the things that I think people were interested in is, what is the relationship to the people whom you share with? And so 27 people answered this question. But as you might expect, a lot of it is family and friends. Some of it is community people, a significant amount to elders, and then less co-workers and acquaintances. So most of the distribution is going to people who not only are known, but have a strong friendship or familial relationship to the distributor. Okay, and then as far as trade, again, we did a supplemental questionnaire, but it was only picked up by 9 people. But already you see quite a diversity of resources that are coming back to Sitka through barter. This would be defined as barter. And so I made a list of different places. So again, one that always interests people is Muktuk. I think it's there almost every year in trade, coming all the way from Barrow in exchange for herring eggs. But lots of other products, typically high-value products that come from other areas that either aren't available in Sitka or are made in some kind of special way, like hooligan oil, for example, is not available in Sitka. Okay, and then another whole feature of this is what we call new organizational means of distribution. So basically, new organizations are getting involved with the distribution, not just households, as was traditional. So this was something we began to chart. And so I mentioned the Sitka Conservation Herring Alliance. They're an organization that's got involved, but so has the Sitka Tribe, so has the Hoona Indian Association, so has the Sealaska Corporation, Alaska Native Brotherhood camps in several communities, senior centers, hospitals, and various charities. And the biggest distributor of herring eggs organizationally from Sitka that I found was actually the Salvation Army. So they would get donations. People would bring their herring eggs in, give them as a donation. They would serve them on special days like Fridays, and they would get 50 people or more, if they heard about it, coming for meals on those days. So very interesting that these new organizations have developed. The one that's maybe has the most well-developed protocol is the Sitka Tribal Program. It's been around since the early 1990s. And it's basically run by their Resource Protection Department. They actually have a director and a traditional foods specialist. And so they work throughout the year to gather various wild foods that are key to subsistence, herring, salmon, deer, seaweed, and so on, distribute up to 20,000 pounds of food per year for the community, including up to 10,000 pounds of herring eggs. And they typically give priority to elders, those who are unable to gather food for health or income reasons, and they set aside some for community events. They don't give them to private households for their kuiks or anything like that. They don't give them generally to outside people unless there's an exceptional reason. So you have to be a resident or a citizen, a tribal citizen. And they also try not to compete with household harvesters. So they limit their effort. They go early to make their sets so that they're not competing and pull them early. And they also monitor and provide spawning updates to other harvesters. So they're providing a service. And then when it comes back, they will be distributed, as is going on here, typically trimmed and distributed in portions, namely the IGA bag. 2-gallon bag is the main way of distributing. And then the Hoona Indian Association one is perhaps the most remarkable because it really hinges on one boat, and that's Vernon Hill's boat, which he's in here, which he will take over to Sitka, and his fuel expenses are typically paid by the Hoona Indian Association. He will come to Sitka spend a couple of weeks scouting, trying to be in the right place for the spawn, and then he will bring it back. And when he comes back, when he rounds the point to come into Sitka Sound, somebody gets on the radio and says, "Here comes Vern," and everybody goes down to the dock, and that's what you see in the middle and the right-hand picture, and they bring their own, wheelbarrows, containers, and so on. And then the Hoona Indian Association will sort of decide, based on how much and how many people, how big a garbage bag you can actually use to get those herring eggs. And then people will use that bag and they will take it home and, of course, redistribute it. So Sitka is a community of about 900. I forget what the native population is, at least 600. But everybody who wants herring eggs can get some through this distribution system. And it's remarkable. And you might say, well, what about the lack of reliability and all of this that's going on? It's become much more risky for him to do this. But what we found is that the Sitka people won't let him go home empty-handed. So if he misses, he gets there a little bit late, he doesn't get spawn on his branches, they will give some branches to him. Now this is maybe counter the economic man argument, which says if there's a limited supply, we're going to take what we can get for us, especially if it's a commons kind of arrangement. But you find just the opposite of that in Sitka Sound, because they know Vern is going home to feed a bunch of their relatives herring eggs in Hoona, and they don't want him to go home empty-handed. So they're going to help him out, even if it comes at their expense. So again, that's, I think, a remarkable value in the herring egg distribution system that prevails. And of course, you can see the happy crew when they're on the other side. Okay, and then when I talk about benefit flows, I'm talking about not just the material benefit flows, but of food security, the fact that this was traditionally and still the kind of break of winter when herring return, and the beginning of the new life that comes with spring and everything that follows. The way it contributes to food feasting, to health and well-being, heritage, cultural identity, ceremonies, and then what I call conviviality, which is really just, I think Ivan Illich wrote a whole book on conviviality, but he defined it as something like autonomous and creative intercourse among people in their environments. And so it's very spontaneous, it's very lively, it creates strong affective relationships as well as awareness of one's connections to the environment. And then another term we use in social science, social capital, is also generated, because you're always eating your herring eggs with someone else, and most people got their herring eggs from someone else. So that whole connectivity, that trust, those networks, that's what's meant by social capital. And then obviously there's skills involved in the harvesting and processing, and so it contributes to something called the good life in Tlingit, and I think that's reflected here in the quote by Vivian Mork, which I won't read because I'm running out of time, and then even more so in this one by Tammy Young from Sitka, which I especially like because she's a person who spent a lot of time in Washington State and living out by Spokane, and she said she used to regularly be invited to her aunt's house, and her aunt's living in Federal Way near Seattle, and she said we'd arrive, and her table would be covered with layers of newspaper, there's the newspaper again, upon which to lay herring eggs, and they'd usually be clams and crab on the table, and then the stories would come out. And she said if we were lucky, somebody from Alaska would actually bring all these delicacies to us, and then they would tell us about the days when they went out and how they harvested and who was with them, all that sort of skills knowledge. And all of these little pieces of information are important because when you believe that your food feeds your soul, all those people that touched your food, that imbued their love and respect into that food, it is one of the greatest gifts that we can give to one another. The love that we feel for each other, the land, and the food we share, the respect that we give to the food is of the utmost importance. And so if you didn't get anything else, I think that is really how I would want to sum up what the herring egg distribution system does for people in terms of social benefits. So just to conclude, we're talking here about a very old system. We don't know exactly how old. I think it's easily centuries old, perhaps millennia. The archaeological record documents herring skeletons, not herring eggs, because they don't really endure in the archaeological record, but herring bones in sites going back 14,000 years. So some of the oldest evidence of human habitation we have is tied to the consumption of herring. So it's a remarkably old system and one that's well-developed, adaptive, and resilient in terms of how it manages its generosity, reciprocity, and resilience. It's also a self-managed system, largely. So the maximum sustainable benefit is really maintained by the households and the other organizations themselves. Very little regulation. Occasionally someone will be cited for selling herring eggs. Those cases are usually dismissed because they end up being something more like customary trade for cash or someone supporting a relative to gather herring eggs. And obviously they contribute to these multiple values of social capital exchange, conviviality, and so forth. And so I want to leave you with this thought. Both maximum sustained yield, which guides the commercial fishery, and maximum sustained benefit have foundations in Alaska's constitution, but they're not equally supported. The benefit flow side, especially through the Alaska Native subsistence economy, is not often correctly valued. It's usually undervalued, it's often invisible, and thus it's easily compromised by the quest for maximum sustainable yield, which isn't always sustainable. So to realize the multiplicity of values and benefits generated and maintained by the herring egg distribution economy, I'm suggesting a paradigm shift is probably needed in fisheries management. Thank you.
We have set up a microphone down in the lower level here. Please come forward if you have any questions or discussion points you would like to make. And,
Discussion points, yes. Oh, I thought I was going to get away.
Oh my goodness, this is short. Hey, this isn't a question. Maybe just Gunesh Chish for sharing this. I'm sitting there stunned and I'm processing it all. But, you know, I think all of us, especially the Tlingit, Ida Simsian, Stratsitis, we all have our stories of what it looked like when we were younger and the stories of it coming in and the sharing. And it's just different to see it calculated and, you know, looking at it in the context of policies. But I really appreciate the way you captured the way it is so communal. I do remember as a child, my mother, you know, it all came to us from various sources, but I do remember at some point where I connected as a mother, like, oh, this costs money to harvest. And I reached out to my uncle in Huna, in Sitka, actually, as we got closer. And I said, Uncle, he said, do you want some, babe? I said, yeah, we'll get some, but we would gladly take some. And I asked him, how much do you want? And he said, well, I never take money. He goes, I just remember him saying that, but just making that connection. But then I think I did send him something knowing that it did cost him, like the gas and the shipping. But I just appreciate you putting this. And I guess for me, I just was really taking that in because I've never thought about it that way. And MSY, MSB, I do have that frustration, of not having the value of how many it feeds, and of this being the land. I know it's complex. I know we have political and commercial tensions, and yet I feel like, what are we as a society if we cannot value the people of the land and let them be the way they have been? I mean, really all we want to do is feed ourselves, and this is more than, there isn't a cash value that you can put on it, the way that we share it and the way that it's brought out. And so, just thanks. Ganeshish.
Thank you for those comments. I think you've identified a really key point in the whole debate is there are these social values, there are these social benefits, even emotional benefits, but when you testify in a Board of Fisheries hearing, those don't really count, right? It's all about the material benefits, and yet we know they're important, we know they're real, so how do we account for them? I think that is one of the issues with management that's very hard, because a lot of them are intangible at some level. Uh-oh, here comes the Fish and Game Commissioner.
Thank you, Tom. I'm Frank Rue. I was Commissioner of Fish and Game for 8 years under Tony Knowles. And I signed a memorandum of agreement with the Sitka tribe and their clan house in an attempt to begin to marry the two systems, to get the subsistence users more involved in the department, in our counting of the spawn, in where the commercial fishery was prosecuted, all those things. And I feel I didn't do enough. But I'm curious, what happened? Would you recount the history of that early effort to bring the tribe into the state system in a much deeper and better way, which was my hope?
Well, I think the spirit of what you were doing was very constructive at the time, and as I understand it, there was a lot of goodwill on both sides to develop a co-management agreement, which is what the memorandum of understanding was. It was an early co-management agreement, but at least at the level of sharing information and concerns. But it was unilaterally ended by the department, I think in 2010. I don't know, someone else might know here. And they gave several reasons for that. I think one was that they felt like they were favoring one group over other groups. I think that was the main reason. I think there might have been another reason, but I can't remember. So that's actually all I know about it. I don't know how many meetings were held, how constructive they were, what the sticking points were. I mean, we know some of them because they endure. But I think there's a lot of tension between the commercial industry group and the Sitka tribe over how the fisheries should be managed. And Fish and Game is caught, in that web. And so they have a difficult job because as things become less productive or less predictable, commercial fishermen have a large investment in their boats and in their permits and in the fishery, and they are really wanting to get that value out of it. And so management changes that would compromise that are heavily scrutinized. So there's that conflict, I think, that was underlying it. But I don't know exactly what the proximal reason for ending it. I mean, I think it was due for renewal, and it was just chosen not to renew it. But I think a co-management agreement along those lines, those kinds of agreements exist in other watersheds and other fisheries, like on the Kuskokwim, for example, and in parts of the Yukon, and they work very, very constructively. So I think it's still a good model, and that might be the kind of paradigm shift that's necessary.
Hi, Tom. Thank you. I also want to thank you and appreciate the sort of scientific and academic position you put on subsistence, harvesting and sharing. That was extremely useful. And I hope they'll get more coverage on with the book, but also the the video of your presentation here. My question is, do we have a sense of the dollar value of the commercial sacro harvest, and in relation maybe to the other? I can't imagine it's going to be really big compared to the other commercial fishing industry, because it's such a short time frame. It's been diminishing, but the dollar value, but then also the companies or the people that are involved in the commercial harvest, are they locally based, or are they all international, Japanese?
Yeah, on the the only value I have is what's recorded as ex-vessel value. I don't know about the market value, but the wholesale value of it has gone down really proportionally in terms of inflation and so on since the 1990s, when Japan's economy was number one, or getting to be moving towards number one. And so, often when that happens, you compensate by taking more or wanting to take more. So that's been one of the issues, to try to make the fishery profitable. But the economic logic of it seems to be in struggle. And another thing they've done to try to recover more value is, as I said, is export the rest of the fish with it, and have that produced into things like cat food and farm fish food and so on. So as I understand it, because I have a Japanese colleague who works on this on the other side, he said that the demand is going down, and I know in some years they basically can't sell all that they produce, so it's frozen and kept. But beyond that, I don't know a lot about the in-country Japanese market, except that I think there are concerns there about the quality of the fish, and there are these kind of connections between them, because really Japan had very good stocks of its own herring, but they were overfished for the same reasons, the reduction used for fertilizer, for agriculture and so on, and they've just never recovered there. Here they've recovered partially, and so we're now supplying what they used to supply for themselves. And some people suggest that this product just really is not a good idea. These fish are so important as forage fish, as foundation fish. Why are you killing them off just to produce a delicacy for basically one market? People have a different attitude towards spawn on kelp, because that's renewable. That also has markets in Asia and potentially in North America as well. So that may be something that's emerging. But no, I think the future of Kaznoko is probably pretty limited.
Well, first I want to thank Tom for all the work you've done. Tom was adopted by the Kagwantan, and he was taught by Herman Kitka and a lot of other people. And I'm so sorry. This is such an emotional issue for us. But first I want to thank Tom, really, for all of the work that he's done, both as a scientist and as an adopted Tlingit. And I hope that by saying an adopted Tlingit, that it in no way biases his scientific work, because I think he's established his credibility in the scientific community. But definitely he brings to his work the inside, the native perspective as well. And He's not only done this work, but he's also worked very hard in finding out our names, working with our people to identify 3,300 names, place names in Southeast Alaska. So his contributions to the Native community, to the scientific community, and to Alaska are multiple. So I want to thank Tom for that. I also want to thank Sitka and the Kiksati, and I know there are Sitka people here, and I thank them for their generosity. Even in the year of 2018, when there was so little herring, they still shared with us. And I saw our people gather when they had memorial services, that they would all bring food, bring their herring eggs there, so that we could all share, and so that we could also feed our ancestors. I have a lot of emotion about this as a Native person and as an anthropologist. For I have said that unless the state changes its management regime, we are going to see the demise of another cultural tradition. It reminds me in many ways of when I went to Cordova after the Exxon Valdez oil spill. I saw the elders crying on the beach, saying that this may be the last time that they had Native food before the oil spill. They were crying that not only their food, but their culture was disappearing right before their eyes. And I have said that of our herring, that unless that management regime is changed, unless we stop giving priority to 48 permit holders, that we will see another cultural tradition disappear from our lands here in Alaska. And all that we have done at Sealaska Heritage is to work to try to preserve our cultures, because we think it brings many benefits to society. If you could have read the testimonies and the depositions and the affidavits written by our people when they were dealing with Fish and Game board meetings, every year they would come and say, the herring are decreasing, the herring population is decreasing, the size of the herring is decreasing, our other natural resources that depend on the herring are disappearing. I know if they were here to say this, they would say it in a strong voice. But yet, when you read their testimonies, you could hear the sorrow that they were feeling. And I just hope, I know we have many friends in the Native and non-Native community who have come to support us. And I pray that Fish and Game will really take a look at its management regime and really, abide by the scientific principles that supposedly our management regimes are built on. But when we take a look at the scientific data, it doesn't appear that science is determining our management regime now. It appears to us that it's the commercial aspect, it's the money that comes in that is taking the priority. So I just had, I didn't want to speak, but I had to speak because it's my duty. It's my duty as a Tlingit, it's my duty as the president of Sealaska Heritage Institute to say these things, to bring to you, the feelings that we have, the emotions that we have about our culture and the possible loss of another cultural tradition. So I wanted to share those thoughts with you. But thank you all for being here, and thank you, Tom, for all of your good work. I hope that you're able to do much more of that continued work. So thank you all.